Hi, and welcome to a small, medium, at large podcast. I'm your host, Gail Heisen, bringing you intimate stories that heal. Listeners, I want to thank you for subscribing, liking, sharing, and all the wonderful comments that have been coming through. I finally figured out how to reply to them, so I appreciate your patience, and I've replied to all of them, and I plan to continue replying to all of them, just that it'll take me a little while to catch up. Today, we may have some new listeners, and we would love if you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we also want you to know that if you go to the beautiful website that my daughter Nancy created for me called a small medium at large.co, you'll find all the shows that we've done there. So if you've missed a show, you can check up there and you'll see all the shows, plus all these other shows I've been interviewed on, photos, stories from Medium. So I think it's like a one-stop shop. Just go to a small medium at large.co and you can find all kinds of information and things about the shows. So today, speaking about my daughter Nancy, she went on a trip to Panama to spend a few days with an indigenous tribe, and she met a gentleman named David Blank. And before I welcome David onto our show, I'd like to read a little bit about him in his bio so you know who we have here today. David Blank is a professional adventure tour guide, psychedelic guide, and dog trainer who has been to 49 US states and 45 countries. He has hitchhiked from the US to Guatemala to study Spanish. He has backpacked and hitchhiked throughout the East and South Africa, and he has spent a year motorcycling 20,000 miles through the US, Canada, and Mexico with his dog Max. David has an MBA in international business and is working on his credentials as a cannabis assisted psychedelic therapist. He has lived and worked in Mexico, Panama, Ecuador, China, and France. As a guide, the only thing that is really important to him, besides sharing his love of the world, is that his clients have a unique, fulfilling, transformational experience that they will remember prominently and fondly for the rest of their lives. Today, we are going to talk about the transformational power of travel. So let's welcome our guest, David Blank. Hi, David.
Hey Gail, how are you?
I'm good. It's wonderful to have you here this evening. I've been very excited about this show. There are so many topics that I want to touch on. So I've kind of divided them up. I have a little list here of the things I'd love to touch on. But before I go into the depth of the work and what you're doing, I always like to find out what is it? Was there anything in your childhood, or did you always know growing up that I want adventure, I want travel, I love animals, or is this something that occurred later in your life? I'd like to know what brought up the point of you deciding I'm going to be a tour guide and travel the world.
Yeah, great question. So I grew up on a farm in upstate New York, um, and I grew up riding horses since the age of like two. Um, my first, when I was 5 years old, I was out riding with my father, and my horse ran away with me. And my father had my little brother, who was about a year old, with him on the saddle, and so there was nothing he could do about it. And he said, we just took off, and off we went, and he just followed us, and a few miles later found us on a hill, with me sitting on the horse. And he said he was so shocked and proud and impressed that I was still on this horse. And he said he told me after that, he said, okay, you can ride anytime you want. Nobody needs to be home. Just go out and jump on the horses. So we used to get the horses. We had them trained to come over to the fence in the corral that they were in, and they would come over, and we'd give them carrots or whatever, and then we would just jump on their back, and they would just run around in the corral, and we would just ride them. So I just kind of grew up in that environment of being really connected with nature and with animals and the outdoors. Um, and it's just always been a passion. Um, so what got me into the guiding was in after I finished. I traveled a lot while I was in university. Did a lot of road trips around the U.S. and things. And after I graduated, I moved to Europe and ended up living in France for a while, which was fantastic. And I had an opportunity to work at a bronze foundry doing bronze sculpture, which I always desired to learn how to do it. I thought it was so cool. And then a friend of mine and I went down to Africa, and we spent a couple months backpacking through East Africa. And we met a guy on a train and from New Zealand, and he was telling us. I said, "Well, what do you do?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm an overland guide." I'm like, "Well, what's that?" And basically, he said, "Well, I just drive people all over Africa." And I said, "Wait, you get paid to do that?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Okay, that's it. That's what I want to do. I figured it out." And so I went to a bunch of companies and asked for work, and they all said, "Sorry, it's season's over. We're not hiring." And one gentleman handed me a business card from an American and said, "This guy was here 2 weeks ago, and he is in charge of hiring for a similar company in the U.S., a company called Trek America." And so when I got back to the States, I called and talked to a gentleman by the name of Jack Hawkes. And Jack hired me and trained me and taught me the passion and power of travel and how it really impacts people's lives. Um, and he gave me a wonderful gift, and we're still close friends. We still talk frequently.
How old were you then?
I was 23 years old. It was 1992,
Hmm.
and I had after being in Harare, Zimbabwe, where I found out about the tour guiding. My friend left and went back to France because she had to go back to school, and I stuck out my thumb. Um, I had the good fortune when I was in University of Colorado in Boulder to meet a really special lady who named Judy, who had in the 70s hitchhiked by herself for 2 years around the country and made a living by going into thrift stores and buying all of the quality vintage clothing and shipping it to vintage shops uh, in New York
Okay.
and selling it on consignment. And she had taught me all about hitchhiking. And so uh, I decided I want to go down to South Africa and see what it was like. So I stuck out my thumb and spent a month hitchhiking all through South Africa.
I have to say, my hitchhiking days were in the late 60s and early 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I hitchhiked from San Francisco to Norman, Oklahoma to meet up with friends from New York. Hitchhiked with my first boyfriend. But when I was alone, I hitchhiked all around New England when I was 13 and 14 years old, never thinking at the time then you it was like it was so relatively safe. You could just put your thumb out. I'd hop on a motorcycle, away I'd go with some guy that I would meet, and we'd maybe spend the night, or I'd see him again, and that would be it, or something. But I was able to travel around by just sticking my thumb out, not thinking that I might be endangering myself in any way at the time, because it felt like it was part of the lifestyle then. Now,
Mm-hmm.
and then you always saw, at the freeway entrances, lines of people hitchhiking. You
Mm-hmm.
don't see hitchhiking anymore. So when you were doing it, I was doing it in the 70s, you were doing it in the 90s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Early 90s, but you
Mm-hmm.
were hitchhiking in another country. Did you also hitchhike around the United States?
Well, I did. I didn't hitchhike around the U.S. to travel. What I did do is, when I was in college, I discovered that the worst place to possibly be during um, exam weeks was on campus,
Hmm.
and so I just the energy was horrible. The stress, the tension. People were so traumatized by everything, and so after the first year, I was like, I'm never going there again. And so what I would do I lived in Boulder and I had a ski pass. And so what I would do is I'd drive about 20 miles out to Golden, Colorado, and park my car, and I would hitchhike up to, the ski areas. And I did that like 3 days a week most of the year. And then the week before finals, when everybody was cramming, all I did was ski. I did all my studying the week before finals. And so I would show up for finals. I'd be totally relaxed. I hadn't been on campus. I didn't have any of that, energy that everybody was putting out. So I hitchhiked 50, 60 days a year to go up
I
and ski.
Oh, so that was the way to get to skiing. You mentioned something about hitchhiking feeling as the ultimate freedom. And I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could share with our listeners what that is, the ultimate freedom feeling. What is it that occurs for you? You're not sitting there worrying about whether you'll get a ride. You're not worrying about where your food or money is. Tell us what that feels like to have ultimate freedom.
For me, it's just the most liberating feeling to be sitting on the side of a road somewhere, um, and having no control, and really, I think we live under this illusion of control, and when you're hitchhiking, there's no illusion. You have no control. You don't know when a car is going to come. I've sat on the side of a road in South Africa, for example, for 4 hours without even seeing a car. Um, and then a car comes by, and maybe they pick you up, maybe they don't, and you don't know where you're going to go. You don't know who you're going to meet. You don't know what kind of experience you're going to have. It really it's funny because it feels like freedom, and yet it's taking all the control out of your hands, and it's really surrendering yourself to the universe. And it was really cool because before we left to go to France, I'm sorry, before we left to go to Africa, um, we were with my friend's mother, and a friend of hers came over for dinner, and he said to us, "I'm just going to tell you one thing before you guys leave. You get in trouble, anything ever happens, you just say three times. You say, 'Please, my angels, give me what I need.' Please, my angels, give me a ride. Please, my angels, give me food. Please, my angels, give me shelter." And it was so funny because I wasn't a big believer in kind of a spiritual or existential kind of world.
Mhm.
But I remember times where we would be hitchhiking somewhere and we'd be sitting for hours and nobody would show up. And I'd say, or they'd be driving by and not picking us up, and I'd say, "Please, my angels, give me a ride. Please, my angels, give me a ride. Please, my angels, give me a ride." And within minutes, somebody would show up. So we just, I just had this wonderful experiences. I met people who um, took me home, and I spent 3 or 4 days with them and their family, and then they'd send me to a friend's house, and they'd send me to another friend's house, and I spent a month in South Africa. I never paid for a place to sleep, and I think I paid for 5 meals in a month.
Wow.
Yeah, and it
There,
was all because of the generosity of all the people that I met.
mhm.
So
And also, you're a very warm, funny, welcoming person yourself. So I don't think that they would view you as a threat in any way. Uh,
no, quite the contrary. There was one guy picked me up, and he had this nervous tick. You remember the nerve. You don't see that kind of thing as much anymore because everybody's on medication now for that kind of thing. But this guy had this nervous, and I was a little concerned about it. And I thought, Jesus, am I going to have to jump out of this guy's truck while we're moving? What's going on here? And my backpack's in the back of the truck. I'm going to be stuck. So finally, he turns to me and he says, "I'm a little nervous, and the reason is I've got all this money." And he pointed to the shoebox in the seat between us. And there was $30,000 in the shoebox. And he said, "Well, I run this logging camp up in the hills of South Africa, and I just picked up the payroll. And it's not uncommon for people in the bank to notify people they know who are robbers that somebody just walked out with a large amount of money, and then people will run up on you and open fire with machine guns, and they don't care if you live or die as long as you crash and stop, and they can get your money. And then I thought, why the hell did you pick me up?
I'm wondering that too.
And he said, well, you're not a threat. I mean, you're an American with a backpack. You're not a threat.
Oh,
and I'm
you're
like,
not a local?
I'm not worried about being a threat. I'm worried about getting killed with you. Why would you pick me up? And he goes, oh no, I have a gun, you know. So I just had all these really bizarre and wonderful experiences. So that's kind of the hitchhiking, and it transformed my life to get out there and have this experience, to trust myself, to work with my intuition, to interact with people that I'd never met in an intimate way.
And also the kindness. I remember when Ricky and I were hitchhiking down Highway 1 in California, and we were, we were from New York. We didn't know what goes on with we're just new to California. And we were out on the by the ocean there, and Highway 1 is cliffs, and anyone who knows about Highway 1 here. And we were never going to get a ride. And it was late at night, and we were just, I don't even know how we got stuck on Highway 1, but somehow we did. And this was on our trip to Oklahoma. And a giant semi pulls over and picks us up. And he tells us, when I saw you out there, I felt so bad for you because I know no one's going to pick you up and you're going to be there till the next day. He said, but it's illegal for us to pick up passengers. We're not allowed to pick up hitchhikers. So he said, I'll let you ride with me until just before dawn, and then I have to let you out. But as far as I can take you, I will. And I'll get you off of Highway 1. And it was the only time I've had the experience of driving in one of those giant semis. And it was like the guy had a whole little living room and house built inside that truck. His bed was all beautiful with television. I mean, it was very luxurious. But the whole time, Ricky and I kind of cuddled together like this. He says, but there's one thing, don't ever push this one button or lever or whatever it was, because I think if you do that, it immediately, like the brakes or something happens with the semi. So I just remember being just sort of like, don't fall asleep, Gail, and push the thing. Don't fall asleep, Gail. And it was but it was such a kind thing to do because he knew since that was his route, he knew that we were not going to get picked up. Mm-hmm. So, it was our first adventure, and we didn't realize we weren't doing the smart thing by going down Highway 1. So it is that wonderful kindness. So I'd like to move on to your tours, because the first tours that I'd love to hear about is your Happy Tales, and the idea that you encourage people to do vacations with their dogs to connect in a more intimate way with their animal and their man's best friend. Mm-hmm. So can you tell me what a tour looks like, and tell me how, like, maybe one wild story you can remember about the dogs and the people, or anything about this, because it's very fascinating. I don't really know anyone that advertises their tours. We have quite a few different tours to discuss with you, but I thought we'd start with the dogs first.
Sure. So we're the only company in the world that does these multi-day adventure tours with people and their dogs.
And the full name of that is?
Happy Tales Canine Adventure Tours. And the website is happytalestours.com. And the idea is the reason that we get dogs, there are a couple of reasons that people get dogs, right? People get dogs for security. The main reason that most people get dogs is as a pet is that they have this idealized attitude or idea that basically everybody wants Lassie, right? I want my canine sidekick, my buddy that's with me, that reads my mind and understands me, and we're totally connected and we're just grooving. And I got a dog out of a pound in Maryland back in 2000. I had just been laid off from a corporate job, and I got a phone call from a rescue organization that did cattle dog rescue, and they wouldn't give me a dog because I lived in an apartment. And the woman was very nice. She said, it sounds like you really know about these dogs, but our rules are, because they're working dogs, you have to have a house. So she calls me up and she said, there's one in this pound. Uh, this is Friday at 4 o'clock. They're open tomorrow until noon. And Monday morning, he's going to be euthanized at 6 a.m. He's been there for 3 months, except for a quick stint in somebody's home before he got sent back for aggression. And so I went down and I looked at this dog. They put me in a small room alone with him and locked the door, closed the door because he was real aggressive and they were, scared. And I sat down in a chair and he and I stared at each other. And he went and sat in a corner as far away from me as he could, and we just stared each other down for about 10 minutes. And then he walked over and he peed on my foot and he jumped in my lap and he licked my face. And I got up and walked out and paid whatever the rescue fee was, $100, and put him in the back of the car, took him home. And a month later, I put him on the back of my motorcycle.
Is this
And
Max?
This is Max, yep. Yep. I actually got a new job. I came home from an interview where I had accepted a new job with an online banking company that was just starting up. And it was a great opportunity. It was a fantastic job, and money was great. This is in Philly. And I accepted the guy's offer. I shook his hand. I walked out. I got in my motorcycle. I drove home to my apartment. And my dog, this new dog, Max, had eaten my cowboy hat and my a handmade wool serape type bag that an Indian woman in Mexico had made for me. And I was so furious, I was ready to kill him. So I sat down and I was like, I'm going to breathe. And all of a sudden I looked at him and he was just sitting there staring at me. And I looked at him and I said, you know what? You're right. I don't want to be stuck inside all day anymore either. And I called the guy and I said, hey, I changed my mind. He said, are you out of your mind? I said, probably. And so I put a crate on the back of my motorcycle, and 3 weeks later, Max and I took off. And the point is that within a short period of time, I had just only had him about 3 weeks. Within 3 weeks of being on the road together, we were totally in sync with each other, totally in tune with each other. And what I learned is that when you take a dog out of, dogs are very focused on consistency, schedule. When you take them out of that environment, it's a stressor for them. And not necessarily a bad stressor, but what it does is it focuses them, or it forces them to focus entirely on the one thing that's consistent in their life, and that's you. Mm-hmm. And so Max was completely focused on me, and we're traveling. I'm completely focused on him, and within a few weeks, we just had this click. We just clicked, and I didn't have to say anything. We communicated energetically.
Does it feel almost like telepathic, the connection where he's sensing exactly what's in your mind, or you're sensing what he thinks, what you think
Yes.
he's wanting?
Yes. And I think we'll talk a little bit about the psychedelic tours, but one of the things that I realized that's really important about psychedelic and psychedelic therapy is George Bernard Shaw had a quote. The single greatest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Right? Meaning we all think we've communicated, but the other person didn't necessarily get what we were saying. And a dog trainer that I worked with years ago when I was studying to be a dog trainer told me the communication paradigm with animals is energy, number one, then sound, and then touch is the lowest and most primitive and least effective form of communication. And so humans are the worst of all the animals at communicating energetically. And I believe that that's because the ability to communicate orally has given us the illusion that we don't need other forms of communication. And so we're not good at it. And that's part of the reason people have problems communicating with their dogs, is they're trying to communicate with their dog orally. And the dog's like, I don't speak English. Right? And so as a dog trainer, my job is to teach humans how to communicate in a way that dogs understand. Right? And so what psychedelics do is they help us to get more in touch with ourselves. And by being able to be more connected to ourselves and more grounded and more present, we're able to be more, we're more tuned into energy.
Hmm.
And so what happens then is our ability to communicate increases substantially because now we're not just using words, we're using energy. And it's all about just perception and being open to it. So with Max, we really connected, and like I said, like it was very energetic. We just could read each other's mind. Plus, he was brilliant. When I first put him on the motorcycle in a crate, the crate was too small, and I kind of had to force him into it. And I took him to a park because I didn't want it too big on the motorcycle, right? So I took him to a park, and we got off the motorcycle, and I put my helmet down so I could throw a stick for him, and he walked over and he peed on my helmet.
Almost cat-like.
And there was like, it was so clear. I said, "Oh, okay, you're not happy with the crate." And I walked over, I picked up my helmet, which I dunked in the fountain in the park to rinse off the pee, and I put it back on my head. I put him back in the crate. I took him home, and I went and I bought a larger, one size up crate, put it on, went home, brought him downstairs, took him to the motorcycle, and I said, "Let's go." And he looked at me and he jumped right up, walked into that crate, sat down, and he was happy as can be. And in 5 years that I had him, only twice did he ever resist getting into the crate because he was just happy to go. People used to say, "Does he like it?" I said, "I don't know, but he doesn't want to be left behind, so I guess he's going to get in."
Well, he must have loved the wind in his hair.
He used to sit on the gas tank a lot too, so he enjoyed it. But so Happy Tales is about helping people to connect with their animal by bringing the animal and them out into a new environment where they're both focused on each other.
So is this something you just do on a one-on-one, or are you taking a group on this
Groups.
adventure?
This is group oriented adventure, multi-day adventures,
Mhm.
um, and it's not. It's so first of all, it's not about come on this vacation and yeah, you can bring your dog, right? Because
Oh,
it's really
no,
focused
okay,
about
I
it's
didn't
really focused
understand.
about yeah, it's about how to connect with your dog and the activities that we do and everything that we do is dog friendly. So it's not like we're going to leave the dogs here and we're going to go into the national park, or we're going to leave the dogs here and we're going to go into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. No, we're doing things that you and the dog can do together.
And is this a 3 or 4 day kind of a tour then? This is not weeks and weeks.
We do like a 3 day tour, we do a 5 day tour, we do a 7 day tour.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. So the idea is to spend time. We're putting together some Southwest tours. Everything's been shut down for a while because of COVID, so we're trying to get things back up and running. Um, but yeah, it's multi-day adventures, getting out, and I have a real passion because I've done adventure tours since 1992. Everything from Alaska to southern Mexico. My wife Claudia, who you met, and I owned a tour company in Panama for 7 years, where we did tours out in the jungle, visiting remote indigenous villages, and our dogs are famous. We used to take our dogs on all our tours. And the big impetus for Happy Tales was I had two ladies who contracted me for a private tour to take them out camping. Um, there's an archipelago of 360 plus islands off the coast of Panama owned by one of the indigenous groups called the Guna Indians, the Guna tribe. And so these women contracted me for a 3 night, 4 day tour. I picked them up at their hotel, drove them 3.5 hours across the country, and when we got to the Caribbean side of the country, I had a guide with a boat waiting to take us out to a private island with only one indigenous family living on it. And I was unloading the gear, and the dogs jumped out of the back of the truck. And these two ladies, they were in their 60s, and they saw the dogs, and they got real nervous. And they came over and they said, "Are those your dogs?" And I was like, Yeah. And they said, they've been in the truck the whole time. I'm like, yeah, they've been right behind you in the back of the truck, in the camper. And they said, do you always bring your dogs with you? And I said, oh, yeah. I said, that's the beauty of owning your own company. You can do whatever you want. And they said, does anybody ever complain? And I said, I had to think about it. And I said, no, nobody's ever complained, but I do adventure tours. Adventure people are usually dog people. And I could see they were nervous, but they were resigned to the fact that they didn't have a choice. We're already here. Um, and so we spent 3 nights, 4 days out on this little island right on this beautiful barrier reef full of tons of fish. And I taught them to snorkel. They'd never been snorkeling before. And we kayaked and we fished and we explored and we hung out in hammocks and we cooked amazing food.
Mm.
And the last night I even made, there's no electricity, but I made homemade ice cream.
Wow.
And so the next day we took the boat and went back to the mainland. And I was loading the truck up and they came over and they said, this has been so wonderful. We just want to say how much we've enjoyed this. It was such an incredible experience. And we really loved the snorkeling and the fish and everything was so wonderful. But the best part of this trip was your 3 dogs.
Oh,
And so that I came home and I talked to Claudia and I said, this really transforms people's life, traveling with their dogs, seeing and having this experience. And I think we should do something about this and give people the opportunity to have the relationship with their animals that we have with ours. Um, and so that's really just kind of what kicked it off. Was like, hey, let's go do this. Let's combine our passions.
that's a wonderful story. Uh, I'm wondering, do the people that come to you that want to do a tour with their dog, is it because they were having difficulties, like say your dog was chewing up the hat and the serape? Are they saying, my dog has just been out of hand and we love him and we don't know what to do? And you may suggest, should we take this tour because that will get us better bonded with the animal? Or is it people who are already bonded with their animal and they just really want to have a further vacationing time with them?
It's both, and I think the customers that we get are not the kind of people that are going to be as deeply bonded with their animal as they could be,
Mhm.
because it's not any fault of theirs. It's just life. It's getting out and spending that kind of time with your dog all the time that creates that bond. And most people, they don't have that opportunity. They go to work from 9 to 5, 5 days a week. They walk the dog a couple of times a day. They maybe walk down to the pub on the weekend and get a couple of beers outside with the dog. And once a month, they go on a hike.
So do you get feedback after they've had these experiences where they feel a closer connection to their animal after they've done this tour with you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
That's a wonderful, I have not thought of it. I was thinking it was when I was reading about this, I was thinking that it was the sort of thing, like you said in the beginning, of what it's not. It's not where you're going on vacation and you're just allowing the dog to come with you. It's where you're having a vacation that revolves around you and your dog doing things together. And that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean going to a museum.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it does. There's museums out there that we've connected with where we um, can take the dogs.
Mhm.
The motorcycle museum in North Carolina. There's different places we've been able to do that and set it up to go.
So if our listeners are interested, they're able to contact you through the website and
Mm-hmm.
they can find out about what it is to take this type of a adventure tour
Yep.
and get closer and bonded with their dog. I've never heard this before, and I think it's a wonderful thing. So I'd like to talk also about now, if we could, the psychedelic water horses cannabis tour. I'm sure I haven't said that exactly correct, but I have to say it interests me. The psychedelic interests me, the water, the horses, the cannabis, the entire tour. So tell
Mm-hmm.
me, what's that about?
So yeah, that's a great question. Um, where to start with that? So the when I was in my 20s and I started doing, so I grew up on a farm, as I mentioned, and when I was about 9.5 years old, my family sold that farm. Up until that time, my father and I were, inseparable. I was always there. I was always with him if I wasn't at school. One of the reasons my mom said she wanted to sell the farm, she's like, you never had a childhood. You were like an adult from the time you were 5 years old, carrying 50-pound bags of feed and, yelling at the workers to get to work and, all this stuff. And then at that point, they sold the farm and opened a framing business. And my father went to New York City and worked for a while. And so my whole life was kind of uprooted. And that caused a lot of trauma for me. My family was still good people and still loved me, and there was no abandonment. But as a child, it felt like abandonment, and it felt like, and I didn't realize until, last year, as I was doing a lot of psychedelic therapy with a guide, that I had gotten into my head that my father had left because I was such a horrible person.
Mm.
And that wasn't the case at all. But as children, that's the things that we pick up, right? Because
Some
children,
parents actually say that to their child.
right?
I've experienced that, but then there's also just the feeling. Anytime for me as a child, the idea, the whole moving as a young child was it feels like you're being torn away from what you've always known as your place. It's
Mm-hmm.
like having your limb taken off or something. This was your house. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very hard to get the concept of moving and relocating to a whole nother place. Of course, the adults know what they're doing, but the child is, in some instances, it's a great relief for the child and they love the new place. But
Mm-hmm.
in some, they're very attached to it and it's very hard for them to let go of that.
Yep. Well, and I think I mentioned the George Bernard Shaw quote earlier. The single greatest problem with communication. Well, I think the single greatest problem in child rearing is the illusion that children are resilient and will get past everything. I think that's kind of a catch-all, uh, go-to catchphrase that people use all the time when they don't have a clue um, as to how it's going to impact children. And look, we don't have a whole lot of clarity on how to communicate, how to raise children, how it's going to impact them because our parents didn't know and their parents didn't know, and it's multi-generational trauma uh, around the whole concept. So
And the pendulum has swung in different directions because in the area when I was growing up, I was born in 1955, so in the 50s and 60s, then it was, the child is to be seen but not heard. A commonness was to get a slap and a slap from the backhand of your dad or whatever if you did something that was out of order. These were normal things. You weren't considered like your parent was a child abuser or anything like this.
mm-hmm,
And then it swung the other way,
mm-hmm,
where children are taking their parents to court, or they don't want any discipline, or every child, So I think it would be nice if it was somewhere in the middle, because I think somewhat of the things that we were brought up from the older generation had its good quality and value to it,
mm-hmm.
respect and things like this. And then there's the importance of letting the child be their own being and be free and not be so controlled by the parent. But the way it's gone, either one extreme or the other, other extreme, if we could find somewhere in the middle, I think that would be a good kind of a parenting spot for that. I mean, I spoiled my children. I didn't want them to suffer in any way or have to have any kind of pain or difficulty. And now I
Right.
realize it's from those things that we learn and grow from. So, but I didn't want any of them to have that.
Yep. Well, and I think that's like a really great segue to where the psychedelics come in. Um,
Mhm.
so I was working with, I had experienced some real significant depression most of my life, and I was always looking for an alternative. From the very first time that I saw a psychiatrist and they kind of threw medication at me, and I came back a couple weeks later and they said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "Oh, I feel good." And they're like, "Great, have a great life. You're good. Keep taking that." But I never felt comfortable I never trusted the medicine. I didn't necessarily feel joy. I just didn't feel despair. I heard somebody say, you know, antidepressants aren't a happy pill; they're just a not miserable pill.
I experienced it once as a teenager. I was seeing a psychiatrist and they put me on something called stelazine, which was some sort of a, I don't know what kind of drug actually it was, but it was in the lines of thorazine, but not as strong. And I think, I forget what the other one was, Ritalin and Cogentin. And I did it for 1 week and I felt like I was nothing. I had no emotions either way. I wasn't sad, I wasn't happy. I was just sort of just like a body just moving through the world. And even though I was only 13 or 14 at the time when I experienced that, I knew that that was something I should not do. But I realized in order to keep the psychiatrist happy, I had to say that I was taking those drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm just very grateful to have been insightful enough to know this is not what I should be on. I'd rather deal with it. I'd rather have the highs and the lows than just be in the middle and just be a blob.
Mm-hmm.
And there are situations where those drugs are needed when someone really is going to hurt themselves. There's a time and place for that.
Mm-hmm.
But as a way of a
Exactly.
lifestyle, that's not how you're supposed to be living. My feeling anyway.
Right.
And
Well,
that's what you were seeing, correct? That
yeah, that's it. I mean, I just, you know, all the years I was on it, I kept trying to find alternatives, seeing naturopaths, doing all kinds of different things. And a couple of years ago, uh, my my stepniece took her life because of depression,
Mhm.
and my family was just devastated and trying to find alternatives. And that's kind of when I started down the. I had done ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru. I'd done 10 days down in the jungle. Didn't get what I had hoped for from that experience. And finally, I found a underground psychedelic guide here in the U.S. Who I started working with, and he explained to me some of the facts of life about it and why I probably didn't get what I had hoped for out of the psychedelics. Um, One of which is not having been off of antidepressants for a long enough period of time before doing them to be able to get the full benefit. And so I worked with this person multiple times last year or this year, and it totally transformed my life. And
And what type of psychedelic are we referring to?
in this case, it was psilocybin and some other psychedelics. Um, and so, on one of my during one of my sessions, one of my visits with him, which were like 10 to 12 hours long each time, um, we were sitting and talking afterwards and kind of integrating my experience. And I was explaining about my passion for travel and tourism and how I see, you know, travel transform people's lives. Um, and that Claudia, my wife, and I want to find a place where we can have a base of operations for our tours, kind of a ranch kind of thing in the Southwest somewhere. And that we wanted to create a space not only for the adventure tours and the dog tours, but also where people could go to safely and comfortably do this kind of work. Because I don't want to hear about anybody else taking their life because they couldn't get what they needed.
Mhm.
And so, but I had to clarify to him, I'm not talking about being a therapist. I'm talking about just providing a space
Mhm.
because I thought it was, I didn't want him to think I was so presumptuous to think that I could do what this person was doing. And he immediately said, well, why not? And I said, well, I don't have, I'm not a therapist. I'm not. And he said, um, but you're a guide. You've been a guide for 30 years. You're passionate. You spend hours and days and weeks and even months with the same people 24 hours a day, ensuring their safety, ensuring their happiness, ensuring their growth. Who would you rather do a psychedelic journey with? Somebody like you or any one of these credentialed, licensed medical doctors who's been throwing medication at you. You know, he said it much more politely than that, but basically been giving you medication for years with no empathy and no real interaction. And who would you rather be with? And I was like, well, I'd rather be with somebody like me. And he's like, you have everything it takes to do this. You have passion. You're compassionate. You're joyful. You're loving. I think you should consider it. And I went home and I talked to my wife, and she's like, yeah, you'd be wonderful at that. And so over the year, he and I chatted and talked, and I said, well, how would I learn this? You know, and I looked at, there's different programs out there, um, but none of them take people that don't have, like, that aren't psychiatrists or aren't, you know, psychologists and have a degree in that. And he recommended me to a program based in Colorado, called Medicinal Mindfulness, that the founder of the program, his name is Daniel McQueen.
Can you say that the name again? I didn't hear it so clearly.
Medicinal Mindfulness. It's called the Center
Oh.
for Medicinal Mindfulness. It's based in Boulder, Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
And the founder, Daniel McQueen, and his wife, Allison McQueen, Daniel studied at Naropa, and his goal was to become an underground psychedelic therapist. And then somebody had suggested to him, have you looked at cannabis as a psychedelic? And he's like, what? No. And they said, yeah. And so he started looking into it. And he's been doing this for over 8 years now, since 2014, since cannabis was legalized in Colorado, working with cannabis as a psychedelic. And the reason that my guide had recommended the program is not only do they take people who don't have the licensing, you know, medical background, but because it's the only program in the country where you can regularly use the psychedelic that you're going to be working with, so that you have experience with it. And for example, today I was speaking with a woman who was referred to me by somebody who is a licensed counselor and therapist, who has trained with ketamine to be a ketamine assisted psychedelic therapist and MDMA psychedelic therapist. And she said, I've never taken MDMA.
Actually, that's who gave it to me, was my therapist.
Yeah, she said, I've never taken it because you're not allowed because of the, you know, there's a very small amounts that you know, it's a very complicated thing because of the FDA and all this stuff. And she'd done ketamine only a couple of times. And so you've got people that are doing this work that don't actually have any experience with these medicines. Mm-hmm. And there's also misunderstandings in the medical field. I've heard psychiatrists who are involved in some of the psilocybin studies say psilocybin should be a one and done. You should take it one time and not ever need it again, and you should be cured, or else it's not going to help you. And everybody that I've spoken to and all the psychedelic therapists that have been working underground for 30 and 40 years are saying, no, that's ridiculous. It's not a one and done. So anyways, this program that Daniel's created, it trains the guides, the psychedelic guides, in all the same protocols and all the same manners that any psychedelic guide would work in.
So are they
whether you're using psilocybin or
mescaline or
whatever it might be, you
so
can work with all.
It can be a chemical psychedelic, or it can be a natural psychedelic, like a mushroom or peyote or.
Correct. So you're training. The training goes across the board. Psychedelics, you know. Now there's specifics for different ones, and you know, medicinal mindfulness is going to be offering courses for people that have graduated from the primary as cannabis-assisted psychedelic therapy course to do ketamine-assisted therapy and potentially at some point psilocybin and DMT and other things, so that you can have specializations. But being a psychedelic guide, as I understand it from the people I've worked with, I mean, you're using the same tools, you're helping, you're guiding people in how to navigate these experiences for their own best interest. As a guide, you're not the healer. the medicine is and the intuition of the patient are working together to, it's like, as Hippocrates said, physician healed, or patient heal thyself, right? It's basically just creating and holding a space for people to have these experiences, these healing and learning and growing experiences.
I have to say, my psychedelic history is from when I was ages 15 to 17, and there was no such thing as a guide. We were taking LSD and mescaline and peyote, and nobody knew anything about what they were doing. They were just popping these trips, and we were having these experiences, but there were no God. It was only later when I wasn't doing these things anymore that I found that there were people that actually were skilled and could guide you on this experience. So we were
Mm-hmm.
just haphazardly taking these drugs. And I didn't take LSD that many times, maybe 3 or 4 times, but the quality and intensity of the LSD that we were taking in fact, my first trip was after I left the psychiatrist's office. My boyfriend and I dropped mescaline and went to downtown Manhattan and was floating all around Manhattan, not even worrying about the traffic or the people or any of this. It was a very beautiful experience. But I didn't try LSD until I was in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco and was given it, not knowing what I was going to experience there. And for me, it was always a very psychic and spiritual opening, connecting to the dead sort of a thing, where my other teenage friends were, it was more about the music and the colors and all these other things. But I would find myself going down this, other path, and nobody could understand why I was saying these things or doing these things. And it was very, it was a very enlightening experience, and I took very small amounts of it. I have to say, I've never done DMT, but I was offered it at Timothy Leary's house when I was there, and I was with my third daughter, my third child, and I was breastfeeding at the time. So there was no way I was going to do any DMT all of a sudden. But I'm sitting at his house. We're on the lawn outside in Beverly Hills. And this guy comes in, he says, we're all doing some DMT in the other room. Do you want to come in and, do something? I looked at my husband. I said, well, you're not breastfeeding, go have fun. But myself, I'll have to pass on this. And I think I've been hearing a lot in, just out in here in the, in speaking with people and things, how much the psychedelic, specifically the mushroom, is being used in microdosing to help PTSD, to help depression, and that they're finding they're getting tremendous results with this. We're not talking about, the 60s going to Golden Gate Park and, running around in the park. We're talking about people that are focusing on healing themselves with a tool that at one time had been legal, and the things that can be done with it. I understand that the LSD that's made today is not like the LSD that was given out in the 60s. It's not the strength of it. I understand it's a much milder amount of, because I've seen young kids and then they tell me they were tripping, and I'm looking and thinking, how did you do all those things? When we were tripping, you couldn't do all those things because it was a much stronger drug. We were melting or whatever.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating that the microdosing definitely is very powerful with psilocybin. And I recently spoke with a young guy in his mid 20s who started microdosing about 4 months before he and I spoke, and he had severe depression issues. And he told me, he said, I was riding my bike down the street in Los Angeles the other day, and I was looking at the sky and just thinking what a beautiful day it was, and I just felt so much joy in my heart. And he said, and all of a sudden he goes, and I'm taking like 100 milligrams of this, and it's what they call a subperceptual dose. You don't notice it. There's no impact on your functioning. And he said, I pulled over, I stopped behind my bicycle, and I sat down and I just started to cry. I was just because I hadn't felt, he goes, I realized it was the first time that I could remember feeling joy since I was a little child.
Oh,
And so the microdosing is powerful. It's also a psilocybin is a neuro, I think the term is neurogenerative or neuroregenerative. It actually helps build new brain cells and new neural pathways. And so what the psychedelics do is they enable you to kind of re-experience or view or go into an experience, a traumatic experience, and whether it's a significant one-time PTSD type experience like being raped or being blown up by an IED in Iraq, or whether it's what they call complex PTSD, which is kind of what I was diagnosed with, where as a child just having so many little events that cause this constant fear of will I survive, that you don't even recognize. The psychedelics give the ability to see these things, and they kind of they've referred to it as polish it over, so that you're looking at it from like a 5,000-foot view, and you can see it from the realistic perspective, of objective, realistic perspective, as opposed to the subjective experience that you had when the event occurred. And then you're able to take this event where you now are saying, wait a minute, that wasn't my fault, or that didn't really happen, or it was different, and take that event, and then once you process it, you can file it away in your brain file where it belongs, right? So if at 10 years old you were attacked by a dog, and now you go through life with all this fear, it's because that you're still living that experience somewhere in your unconscious, in your subconscious. So you can take that event and you can file it away where it belongs and take it out of your present and put it back in the past where it belongs, and then you can move on with your life. And so it's tremendous what it's able to do. And what the cannabis assisted psychedelic therapy is, what's amazing about it is that it is extremely powerful, and it really mimics all the different types of psychedelics. So people, it comes on like an MDMA experience where there's this heart opening, and it enables people to, like I said, look at those experiences and put them away. It also, people who've done a lot of DMT or a lot of ayahuasca often say, wow, that was as intense as, and just like the most intense ayahuasca or DMT experience I've had. So it mimics these other psychedelics, and yet it's very gentle.
I don't
And
understand what that is. Like, are you just, when you're saying cannabis, I've smoked cannabis for 50 years now. I don't know what you mean by it being psychedelic.
okay, I'll explain that. So
Okay.
first, the cannabis has the power of all these other psychedelics, to many degrees, and yet it also is very gentle, and it provides a lot of agency. Meaning, if you take LSD, you're going to ride that trip out till the end. Same thing with ayahuasca, DMT, or psilocybin. And if it's a hard trip, I don't want to say it's a bad, because I think bad is not properly used. Just because it's not pleasant doesn't mean it's not a very good experience with growth.
Exactly.
But with the cannabis, you have the agency to like say, I can't take this right now. It is too intense. I'm going to take my eye shades off, sit up, get a drink of water, take a break, put them back on, put the music back on, and go back into the experience. You can do that. So it's really beautiful how it does that. And some of the people that I've worked with, I worked with somebody the other day with Parkinson's, who struggles, like I'm sure most people do, with being diagnosed with this terminal disease that is going to take away your independence.
Right.
And one of her comments afterwards was, "This is the best I felt since my diagnosis." I worked with a 70-year-old gentleman who said, since I was 4 years old, I didn't even realize it. Since I was 4 years old, I believed I was responsible for this event that happened in my family that had absolutely nothing to do with me. I was 4 years old, and I've lived with that guilt. That guilt has defined my life, and I didn't even know I had it. And in this session, not only did I recognize it, I forgave myself, I let it go. So it's very powerful. Now, as far as the psychedelic aspect, so um, I'm sure you've
Just
had
want
types of,
just want to interrupt one thing just to bring light to this also, because we're talking about Parkinson's, is the amazing ability that CBD has in helping people with uh, uh, brain disorders that give them, they go into traumatic seizures. There's children I know who have been helped by something called Jaden's juice that a woman created for her child because he was living with, I'm not sure if he was epileptic or what exactly it was, but I firsthand know an experience with a child who's born with a rare, very rare disease, and the child had not been able to get out of bed. He was 4 years old, I think. And when he started on the Jaden's juice, he was playing with his parents for the first time since
mm-hmm,
he'd been born. He
mm-hmm,
had never gone, he went 28 days without a seizure, and he'd never had that experience in his life. Not that his life was that long, but those seizures are very traumatic on the damage to the cells in the brain. And
right,
CBD was helping this. And they had read about it, and they had read about the Jaden's thing, and they tried it, and there was tremendous results. And so it's so important for all this kind of information to get out there firsthand. It's not, I'm not telling a story, it's a story about someone I know. It's not
mm-hmm,
just a story out of nowhere.
yep,
And it's changed the child's life. They'll never get rid of the disease that the brain was born with, but they have it at a manageable level where the child can participate and be part of life again. And this is this is tremendous things for people who have no idea that this is going on out there. And the psychedelic and microdosing, I think this is very important for us to be telling this out there to people who have not heard that this is going on and that there's very, very positive results that are coming from this.
mm-hmm, absolutely. It is transformational. It is completely transformational for
And
people.
your idea to create a space, I see it like a retreat place in my mind,
Mm-hmm,
uh, to create a place where people could come and do that in a safe and total environment, not
yep.
necessarily in their home or in your office or in Golden Gate Park. This is, I think you're onto something that's going to be very important.
Yeah, yeah. It really is. It's 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 something that can really change the world. So many people are suffering, and if you really go into history, if you really look at all of the things that happen and the behaviors that people have, so much of it is based on childhood trauma and inability to deal with things. And it's psychedelics, whether it's cannabis or psilocybin or DMT or ibogaine, they're incredibly healing, and they're here. I believe they're here for a reason, and they're here for us to use. And so, yeah, we want to get it out there. We want to, after doing this session with this friend of mine who has Parkinson's, and her comments about I want to do this every week for the rest of my life. I this is like a mini vacation. I said, all right, we're going to put together a kind of a group, an online group where we can do this online and on a weekly basis, and we can invite other people that have Parkinson's and other terminal or severe diseases and illnesses that can benefit from this, because whatever we can do to give back and to help people have a better quality of life, and not live out the end in fear or despair. Um,
This is
it's
absolutely, absolutely wonderful work.
Yeah.
So we're drawing on our hour now, so I'm kind of winding us up, and I feel like that was a good ending of what is offered with the psychedelic uh tales or trails or
So yeah, so what we want to do is we're gonna do, it'll be like retreat styles and tours, and we'll be out in nature, and we'll incorporate doing some of these psychedelic cannabis sessions with people. Uh, like we'll do like a 5 day and a 7 day tour. 5 days because it's convenient. People can come for a weekend and 3 business days, and they don't have to miss a whole week of work. Um, and incorporate being in nature, using the cannabis, um, doing these kind of cannabis circles, as Daniel refers to them, these conscious cannabis circles with people, and allowing them to have this experience, and doing a couple of these experiences, because it tends to be like one experience can open things up, and start to reveal things that have happened and the traumas, and then the second experience helps to close it. And then, most importantly, and if there's nothing else that I say in this whole podcast that's important, is that integration in psychedelic therapy is the most important part, as or more important than the actual experience. You could have the most incredible experience where you realize that, like, oh my God, it wasn't my fault. My mother killed herself. Oh my God, life is wonderful. I, you know, but if you don't integrate it, you lose it. And there's people out there. Part of my training will be on integration, helping people to integrate, having meetings after the session, follow-up sessions. Um, but integration is key, right? Because it's like learning to shoot baskets, or learning to drive a car. If you don't do it again and again, it's not going to stick with you. You won't get it. So the one thing I can say is, anybody that goes into doing any kind of psychedelic therapy, make sure you have integration, body work, somatic therapy, talk integration with somebody who's a skilled integration specialist, not just your psychiatrist or your psychologist, because it's got to be people that really understand the power of the psychedelics and what things mean. And it's important for somebody to be able to say, yeah, you had a really crappy experience in your last psychedelic trip, but it wasn't bad. It just was unpleasant, and it might take a few months for you to work it out, because there's, Daniel McQueen always says a symptom is just something that's halfway out.
I think how I got to know Timothy Leary in the last 2 years of his life, and he was a very close friend to my husband. That's how I got to be with Timothy Leary. How proud he would be right now, knowing that there are people out there like you doing this, and knowing the value of what this can be. And I'm just thinking how he would be glowing right now, wherever Timothy is, that this is what's happening with this. I want to also mention, before we come to our close here, that you're writing a book that you're having out in 2023 called A Thousand Miles of Elvis. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that just before we close here.
So, A Thousand Miles of Elvis is just kind of like my autobiography, my experiences. When I came back from Africa, I was waiting for the job to start as a tour guide with Trek America, and I was staying with some friends in Boulder. And she said to me one day, she goes, "Why do you do this? Why do you do this crazy shit that you do? Hitchhiking in South Africa during apartheid, and I had to think about it." Um, and I looked at her and I said, I do the things that other people are afraid to do because I'm afraid to do the things that other people do. And my life has been, I've had a lot of challenges, a lot of emotional challenges, but I've lived an amazing life. I mean, growing up riding horses, traveling the world on a motorcycle, hitchhiking, being a tour guide, having somebody hand me the keys to a van and $4,000 and a group of young people, mostly beautiful women, and saying, see you in a month, don't kill anybody. Um, but just, and from us having dinner and just the stories that come out, they're just hysterical
Yes.
and bizarre. So
I can
the
tell the listeners when your book comes out, I highly recommend it ahead of time because I've heard some of these stories and they'll have you laughing your ass off.
yeah. Yeah, so I've got all these stories I'm constantly sharing, and I just need to put them all, finish putting them all together, and put them into a book. The title, I was hitchhiking between uh, Cape Town, South Africa, and Johannesburg on my way back up to Zimbabwe, where I was flying back to Europe from. And a guy picked me up, and his name was Killer Kudu. He was a South African master sergeant in the military, and he had been in 3 wars. I think Angola, um, Rhodesian War before it became Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. And so Killer a kudu is a type of like a deer, and so why they call him Killer Kudu I don't know, but anyway, so I rode with him for about 1,000 miles, and he only listened to Elvis.
God.
And we got to Joburg at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I had a place to stay. Some people that I knew through a friend that I was going to stay with, but I couldn't call them at 3 in the morning. So uh, I said to him, "Hey, will you do me a favor? Just drop me off at the airport, and I'll grab a hotel room, and I'll sleep until 10 o'clock, whatever. And I'll call my friends." And he said, "There's no way in hell I'm getting off of this highway to drive you to the airport. This is the most dangerous city in the world."
Oh,
And he said, "I'll drop you off. It's only a mile, and you can walk to the airport." And I looked at him and I said, "Are you out of your fucking mind? You're Killer Kudu, and you won't drive, and you think I'm gonna walk?" So I ended up having to ride an hour out of Johannesburg on the other side with him, and then get off at a gas station where I slept on a bench for a couple hours. Then I hitchhiked back into the city. But I just thought, that 1,000 miles of Elvis, it just kind of made it all make sense.
it does. It's a great title. Well, I just want you to know that any of our listeners that are interested in finding out about tours with their dog, connecting to their animal, having psychedelic or cannabis experience, that all of your information will be on our description. So they'll be able to find it there at any time. And I want to thank you so much for being on our show today. I find you to be a very, very, very fun and exciting person to spend time with. And I look forward to when you'll be able to be more booking tours when COVID passes on someday and you're able to take people back to unusual places. I wore an indigenous a Huichol necklace that was made for me since that you had met on an indigenous tour with my daughter. And I want to thank my daughter for bringing some very interesting people into my life. And I want to thank you for being here tonight. And we want our listeners to subscribe, comment, let us know how you feel about the show. Let us know if there's any questions you have. You can ask us and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And also that, remember, stories can heal. And if you share your stories, there can be healing with each other. And have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye. Okay.